a sort of build-up period. So a lot of sanctions export controls and sanctions measures were sort of put out over a relatively short period of time. The sanctions against Russia are, I guess, I wouldn't say they are the most comprehensive U.S. sanctions against a single country. The U.S. does maintain comprehensive sanctions against Iran and Cuba, North Korea, but those other sanctions took a little bit of time to build up. But this time, I think in part of the domestic and international political pressure, the U.S. government chose to roll out this comprehensive set of sanctions and export controls measures over a very short period of time.
Right. How do you think it will impact global economy, including Chinese companies? Will be the potential influence on Chinese companies?
Yeah, I think for Chinese companies, even if the Chinese company does not directly conduct any business with the United States, it still could be effective to the extent that it conducts business with Russia. It's really, I would say on a very high level, I would say there are three broad categories of impact. So first, a lot of products previously supplied by Chinese companies to Russia now probably cannot be legally supplied to Russia from the U.S. government's perspective without a U.S. government license, even if the relevant items are entirely made in China. But to the extent that they incorporate a certain amount of U.S. origin content, or to the extent that they the relevant manufacturing or R&D process uses certain U.S. technology or software, now those products might be subject to U.S. export controls jurisdiction. And depending on the classifications of the relevant items, those items could, from the U.S. government's perspective, require a U.S. government license to be exported by a Chinese company to Russia. The second category of impact is really dealings with sanctioned Russian parties that are sanctioned by the U.S. government. So because U.S. sanctions have extraterritorial reach, to the extent that a Chinese company conducts business with a sanctioned Russian target, even if there's no U.S. nexus whatsoever, like no U.S. dollars involved, no U.S. persons, no U.S. origin goods, but still those Chinese companies could be sanctioned by the U.S. government because of the extraterritorial reach of the U.S. sanctions measures. I think a third category of impact is that, at least over the short term, a lot of Chinese companies doing business with the Russian parties could encounter payment issues. Right. Because we have seen that many, I would say most Russian banks are now under some sort of U.S. sanctions. Right. Again, those sanctions have long-arm impact. Right. Because of that, a lot of the global banks, including Chinese banks, have cut off their relationship with these Russian banks. And some Russian banks are even kicked out of the SWIFT system. So as a result of that, over the short term, Chinese companies could encounter payment issues, even if the relevant transactions are not conducted in U.S. dollars.
Right. So what a global disaster. Shen Yi, as we previously discussed, this kind of sanction has appeared before during 2015 Crimea crisis. The agenda for such kind of crisis is really to give pressure to Russia. But do you think Vladimir Putin will take such pressure?
It's quite clear that Vladimir Putin did not take care of that kind of sanctions. Comparing to the threat perceived or framed in Putin's world, such kind of comparativeness on one side, the economic loss produced by these sanctions. On the other side, the loss of territory or threat to national security of Russia. Of course, preference the later, not the further. That's the first. And the second, theoretically speaking, actually, the United States has a lot of research on these sanction issues. Right. They find, frankly speaking, as a foreign policy options, most of these sanctions only will empower, or how to say, they forged the actors who had been sanctioned targeted to continue their negative behaviors
Right.
unless you enjoy a kind of overwhelming power. So here is the most ironic part. If United States is powerful enough, it's not necessary for United States to use these sanction tools. He just say a signal, no, I would not allow you to doing this. Then the other side will stop doing these things. Mm-hmm. On the other side, where United States not only use these sanctions, but the sanction become the only options he can use during such kind of, how to say, the game among the great powers.
Right.
The other side, for example, the Russian side will not take care too much of that.
Right. So basically, you just mentioned that, as we just said, this policy could not deter Vladimir Putin from what he wants to do. And the other thing that we noticed is that during this sanction, oil and gas are actually not part of that. So Professor Guan, what is your take on that? Why, they carved out oil and gas? I know Chinese language, speaking Chinese is the language you prefer. It's okay. I'm going to translate for you. Just please go ahead.
好，我简单说一说这个这次油价呢，因为是历史上第3次超过100美元。我原来在石油企业工作的时候呢，就一直关注和跟踪分析油价啊，这确实是一个标志性的事件。其实这个乌克兰危机对于中国，就是如果是从短期啊，就是直接的这个影响没有那么大，因为俄罗斯和乌克兰呢。相对于中国来讲，它都是2个比较小的经济体。我稍微介绍一个数据，大家就清楚了。2020年，俄罗斯的 GDP 呢是1.48万亿美元，和我们广东省差不多，还小，比广东省小一点。人均 GDP 呢刚刚过1万美元。乌克兰的 GDP 呢是1560亿美元，和我们中国广东省东莞市规模差不多。它的人均 GDP 呢大概是0.37万美元。那么当然中国呢是俄罗斯的这个10倍，就是这样一个体量，就是短期的冲击，说实话没有那么明显。当然我们更关注的就是它长期的这个冲击啊。那么毕竟俄罗斯是能源出口大国，乌克兰是农产品出口大国啊。像乌克兰的它的大麦占全球这个出口份额的超过17%，油菜籽呢占全球出口份额的将近15%。这都是大国。那么这个呢，目前从这个对全球经济和中国经济的影响来讲，主要还是担心粮食价格的长期的这种上涨以及带来的通胀。因为通货膨胀问题本身呢，现在呢，就是一个棘手的问题。美国的国内的通货膨胀呢，已经创了40年以来的这个新高。所以如果乌克兰局势不能很快的得到缓解，那么比较高的这种石油天然气价格可能会持续的时间比较久。那么这个呢，对于全球经济啊刚刚出现的这种复苏的这种这个势头啊，其实打击还是很大的。那么是不是会出现上一次石油危机那种情况，还需要观察。因为上一次石油危机它不仅仅是说这个巴以冲不仅仅是说这个2伊战争以色列和中东国家的这个战争啊。那么还有呢，主要是因为布雷顿森林体系的这种解体啊，主要是美元体系，美元和这个我们说原来的布雷顿森林体系这个双挂钩一固定这个体系这个解体了。所以目前我们最担心的还是持续的通货膨胀问题，这个会对全球经济制约各国的这个货币政策，当然对股票市场的影响也是非常大的。
好，我先来简单翻译一下。Okay, so Professor Guan just mentioned that this is probably the third time out of his observation that oil price hit above $100, which is a symbolic event. However, in the short term, this probably wouldn't bring too much repercussion to Chinese economy for obvious reasons, because Ukraine and Russian economy in terms of GDP size is relatively small compared to China. He gave an example saying that for instance, Russia's GDP size is as big as the size of Guangdong's GDP. That's a province in China. And Ukraine's GDP is the same size as Dongguan, which is a city under Guangdong province. So in that correlation, that wouldn't have too much impact in the short term to Chinese economy, despite the military tension. However, the oil price, if continues skyrocketing, that will bring the problem of inflation. The inflation is probably a global problem that we are going to tackle. We have to tackle cycle right now, not only in the US, but also in China. Especially Ukraine has a big export in the agricultural products sector. And if the price of agricultural products keeps going up, together with oil price, those commodity price surge will bring those inevitable inflation problem. This will become a genuine problem that we need to face from the economic side. 那就是这个Professor Guan， 我再来 follow up your question. I'm going to follow up asking Professor Guan. So if this inflation does continue, and you know the oil price wouldn't drop in a short period of time, how would that actually affect the monetary policy globally in the United States and also in China?
如果通胀继续持续的话呢，可能有两种情景啊，就是说，因为现在呢，各国中央银行包括美联储呢，也在走一步看一步。目前我们中国国内的这个通货膨胀水平呢，其实是不高的，因为中国今年主要是解决，我们说我们就要解决这个质的问题，主要是经济下行压力比较大。我们的这个物价水平呢，总体还是可控的。今年，这个昨天这个中国这个政府工作报告里头也讲到了啊，2022年通货膨胀目标大概去确定3%，这个目标其实还是可以完成的啊。我们通胀压力不大，那么美国的通胀压力大，因为美国为了应对这个通胀呢，那么美联储的它现在态度相对比较强硬，啊，它试图通过加息来解决这个问题啊。当然了。就是现在看呢，这一轮的通胀，它主要不是因为各国这个中央银行这个所谓相对比较宽松的这种货币政策造成的，主要还是因为生产端，啊，就是在乌克兰危机之前，其实这个通胀问题已经是比较严重了，因为它主要是生产端的问题。为什么呢？就是2008年以后呢，整个国际石油天然气市场持续的这个我们出现这个所谓资本开支减少的问题。简而言之呢，就是没有人往里继续的投钱，而且多投钱，所以呢，它这个产能是跟不上的。那么2020年下半年出现了一个所谓从低价格周期进入到高价格周期的一个这个我们说扭转。那么再加上乌克兰危机导致呢，原来大家担心的这种高油气价格啊，整个上游价格如果比较高的话呢，那么带给世界各国这个通胀压力就比较大了。那么所以。短期来看啊，就是各国中央银行它解决不了生产问题，它只能通过加息去解决所谓的通胀问题。但是呢，加息并不足以扭转这次的通胀，因为这次的通胀问题主要是因为生产端出了问题，这是一种情景。第二种情景呢，就是说由于通胀导致经济再度衰退，目前美国经济的情况还是不错的啊，它疫情以后应该说恢复的还是非常好的。我们中国呢和美国正好出现了一个我们叫货币经济金融周期的错位。我们在解决所谓经济下行压力过大的问题啊，那么他们在收缩，我们实际上在宽松啊。但是如果通胀导致经济再度陷入衰退，那么我想无论是欧洲也好，日本也好，还是特别是美联储，它可能会放缓啊加息的脚步，甚至说这个可能彻底逆转。如果通胀问题这个。和经济增长问题、就业问题比起来的话，那肯定还是就业问题和增长问题更重要。它可能重新再度转入这个放水的这种局面。或者这么说啊，从长期来看，这个放水的这个局面可能很难避免。这2年我们看到的，通过加息去抑制通胀，这个只是一个插曲。
Right. Okay. So Professor Guan basically just summarized there are two scenarios in terms of the monetary policy for China and the United States. First of all, the inflation pressure in China is not that big comparing to the United States. The United States is now facing a de facto inflation problem. So scenario one is that United States will keep its interest rate hike and trying to resolve the problem of inflation. However, by only hiking interest rate may not be able to resolve may not be able to resolve inflation fundamentally because currently the inflation was caused largely due to the production constraint instead of the monetary loosening. And then the other scenario is that China and the United States are mismatching in terms of the monetary cycle right now. So if global economy is back to a recession, adding this military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, probably both countries or global economy needs to think about how to stimulate economy back to its original track. So the monetary loosening policy may back on track instead of the tightening policy. So these are his two scenario analysis. So Shen-Yi, from your perspective, okay, if this military tension continues, Ukraine economy, Russian economy are going to be affected for sure, and even European economy. So what's left after that? It's only China and the United States. Is this going to be like bipolar system? Does that bring any stability at all?
I think that it's, how to say, you have, I think, about 2 layers to understand these questions. The first, from the geopolitical layers, frankly speaking, even though this military operation continues,
Right.
the real geopolitical effect will mainly focus on the European continent, which Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union located. It's quite limited. Actually, it's quite clear that Russia did not want to level up, escalate to a full-scale so-called war actions in this European continent. Neither NATO want to have a direct military confrontation with Russia on this Ukraine land, so they keep cautious to avoid such kind of escalation.
Right.
But in the global layers, there's another story. It's quite clear the European Union and the United States feel very, very reluctant to raise economic sanctions toward Russia action in Ukraine. You have to find out that in White House homepages, when Vladimir Putin signed these files to recognize those 2 people republic in the Ukraine regions, the first wave of U.S. sanction even did not name it an invasion. They just say that it's a kind of a first wave of sanction toward Russia's recognition of 2 public and blah blah.
Right.
And in the press backup call, the anonymous White House official make a very clear announcement. He said that that's not a sanction toward the Russia invasion. That will be more gravity of sanction to those incoming invasions.
Right.
But this first wave in action, they have very limited toward the Russian peoples and very few Russian financial institutions. So it's quite clear they not want to bear the burden. It's not the United States say that we can bear any cost to fight any enemies, to support any friend, to ensure this democracy and freedom. It's not that time. The United States and the European Union, it's quite clear they cannot afford the cost of the over-escalation of this sanction. I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, the Department of United States already sent a clear signal to Russian side, say that if Russia stop or withdraw its military action, the troops from the Ukraine, they will also cancel all these new sanctions toward Russia when this invasion begins. It's quite clear there will be a short-term policies if we can find a kind of solutions to this situation in the foreseeable futures.
Right. That's an interesting point. Before this military tension started, I think, you were also predicting that the war or, the military tension probably will naturally start. Yeah. It's going to stay in a, chilled and cold state. But, it actually just gets escalated to what it is now today. And now you are talking about the possible ways to get a exit from this sanction, from this whole tension. So what are the possible solutions in your mind? And, tell us, when you did your projection of this cold status, what was wrong?
I know there's a lot of story on the social medias about my lectures. It's a telecom to those people doing financial books. Actually, they asked me the question, do you think that U.S. and the European Union, the NATO's, will have a war on this Ukraine with Russia? I think that would be a war impossible because these nuclear powers, they never fight. They will try to avoid such kind of direct conflict. The second, my logic to make this judgment say that it will be impossible to launch kind of wars, because I cannot, hard for me, it's not Putin, I'm not Putin, it's quite clear that. I just, very difficult to find a stopping point. Right. You know that when you're talking about military actions, it's easy to find a reason to persuade you that it's necessary to launch these actions. But what's more important, you need to have a stopper. It's kind of red line. You go to that line and then you stop action. And on the other side, such kind of line is not unilaterally determined. It needs to be recognized by both sides. If the other side, they just accept that line, this conflict will continue, and then you will never stop it. It's quite clear. If Russia met another Afghanistan situation or Vietnam situation in these Ukraine countries, it will be a disaster.
Right.
On the other side, then it's quite clear. Today, the latest development is found out it's not that easy for Russia to find stop lines in these Ukraine issues.
Right. Professor Guan, what is your take on that? Where do you think this? Is there any stopping point at all from Shen Yi's perspective? Once the war is started, once the military tension started, it will be very, very hard to stop. 管总，你怎么看这个问题？就是你觉得在哪里可能我们会有一条线可以让这个整个的军事行动给它停下来啊？因为整个的这个军事行动一旦开始，可能要停下来会非常的难啊。管老师可能掉了 ，OK， 哎，上来了，管老师，您听到我刚才的问题了吗？
不好意思，我刚才没听到，我以为这个有什么敏感词中断。
对，没关系，我重新来问一遍。就刚才沈毅老师提到，就这个战争也好，军事行动也好，一旦开启，它实际上要停下来是非常困难的。那这一条红线在哪里？你觉得如果现在要让这一切都停下来，可能要解决几个关键的纷争，到底会在哪些地方？
这个问题确实是像沈老师他们这个国际问题专家要回答的问题啊。我们也在看这个一些资深的国际问题专家他们的分析啊。当然，因为我们掌握的这个信息有限，现在无从得知说到底会如何这个停下来。因为战争这事儿这是高级政治，经济问题这是个低级政治问题啊。那么当然从我们这个善良的愿望这个角度呢，我们是希望尽快停下来，因为打仗对谁都不好。不但是打坏了经济啊。而且也打坏了整个这个市场，但是似乎政治家们不这么考虑问题啊。那么最后这个乌克兰危机这个事儿能停下来，我想按照我们这个以往的这种常识性的理解可能到最后呢，大家都打疲了啊，然后呢，互相都不想打了啊，得到这个时候啊，然后得有一个所谓分出胜负，各得其所的这么一个过程。目前从我一个外行人的这个角度来看，我觉得可能还没有啊，这是第一点。第二点呢，就是说，目前这个欧美的这个制裁对于俄罗斯这个经济的影响确实还是非常明显的。那么看它这个卢布的这个贬值的这个程度，那么也看它被这个可能会被踢出这个 SWIFT 系统啊，那么确实影响是非常非常大的啊。可以这么说吧，就是这场战争。我们不能光算这个军费开支啊，那么看这个经济影响的话，这个代价确实是太大了啊。那么当然，从这个地缘政治这个角度考虑啊，我们去梳理过往的战争啊，对于经济和市场的影响，因为从车臣战争也好，从格鲁吉亚战争也好，从最近发生的几次战争来看啊，都会导致什么呢？对经济短期的这种重创，以及对市场的这种对股票市场的这种。影响，因为大家现在都这个避险情绪非常浓重啊，不敢轻易出手啊。一般来说呢，当这个市场能够敏锐地感知到可能最坏的情景过去了，这种情况基本也能看到说，就是这个股票市场就见底了啊。但目前呢，大家似乎还没有形成这样的共识。从
Oh, yeah.
Right. Oh, okay. Professor Guan just dropped. So let me summarize what he just said to us. He said, this military tension will cost tremendously to our whole global economy. Most direct reflection will be on the market side. Equity markets, global markets are going to tank. We have already seen ruble tumbled about 30%, which is not only to Russia as one country, but also to global economy as the chain effects will influence this whole global economy. And he also mentioned the global markets probably hasn't bottomed up in his mind because if it's really bottomed, then this is good news. But apparently in his mind, there's still there's still a long way to go to get investors' sentiment back. So that is his insights. He also mentioned a very interesting thing is. Economists are really worried about that because that influences global economy, but apparently politicians, they don't think the same way, right? So Professor Shen, let me get back to you again on this thing. So, Henry Kissinger once actually gave his comments on Ukraine many years ago. He said that Ukraine should actually be regarded as a bridge between the West and East, instead of, the situation that it was it is facing right now. So after so many years, why no one listened to Henry Kissinger from the United States?
So that's very, very good questions, and maybe the most ironic part of it. I say that if what you say that what Putin wants, actually Putin wants the NATO to keep its promise.
Right.
In 1990 or in 1991, you read those declassified National Security Archive, you'll find that the James Baker, the Secretary of State of the United States at that time, make a promise to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the former Soviet foreign minister,
right.
say that if they allow the German to keep inside NATO after unifications, the military presence will not move 1 inch eastward. Mm-hmm. It's a promise. He made this promise 3 times.
Right.
And at the same time, the director of the CIA go to the KGB's Lubyanka main buildings, ensure the boss of KGB that the United States, the NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. It's a promise.
Right.
So when we talk about the relationship among states, you need to focusing on this trust and confidence. But this trust of confidence among the state actually is the trust and confidence to which extent the promise produced by such level officials can be kept as a kind of promise. You can say that you can make a very spin, a tricky game, say that it's their promise. It's not a treaty. They just speak it. But if the NATO never make a formal commitment to Russia, to Russia side, to the leader like Putin, it's kind of spin.
Right.
You must be kidding me. So I cannot trust you anymore. I think the most pathetic is for people like Henry Kissinger, who familiar with geopolitical. It was quite clear the Ukraine should never ever be taken as part of NATO because it will trigger the tough military counterback from Russia side. It cannot launch so-called balance of power or the balance of this geopolitics. But on the other side, since I think 1997, the expansion of NATO become a domestic politics card for Europe and the United States.
Right.
Those politicians use this card to get their support to launch political mobilizations domestically. But they have a very naive thinking. The United States and the European Unions can do everything it's won because they win the Cold War. The winning of the Cold War, the collapse of USSR means we are freedom. We finally enjoy this freedom on this continent, and we can go anywhere we want. And we are right. We are freedom. We are democracy. You should not stop me. You don't have right to stop me. I can do everything because I'm freedom. It's how to say it's kind of very childish, but these childish peoples got the position, elected as their leaders, and they continually make this stupid move in last 30 years. And finally, we come here.
Right. So basically, what you're saying is that
you cannot find a solution in one day because you make this mistake for 30 years.
Right. So those are cumulative efforts, the so-called efforts from United States and the NATO caused the status quo. Roy, you are in the United States. I'm sure that you heard about Monroe Doctrine a lot, or before at least. So tell us about your understanding of Monroe Doctrine. I'm sure this is currently discussed in the States a lot.
Yeah, I think this is. I think both Mr. Yang and Professor Guan made very good points about why the current situation occurred. I think there's probably, of course, I'm just an attorney here, but I think there are some discussions in Washington, D.C. About the causes of the current situation. And many people think that there are probably some miscalculations on both sides. So first of all, on the U.S. side, they probably underestimated Russia's determination to really enforce this red line. Mr. Yang discussed, and for Russia, Ukraine is a red line. But I think a lot of people in power in the U.S. did not really realize that to a full extent. And on Russia's part, the miscalculations probably occurred on two levels. So first, they sort of underestimated Ukraine's will to fight, Ukraine's will to resist Russia's invasion. On the second level, which is like more relevant to my area of expertise, there are some important signs indicating that the Russian government probably underestimated how far the United States and EU were willing to go as far as sanctions are involved. Well, I agree with Mr. Yang and Professor Guan that it's very difficult to predict the outcome of the war. But from my perspective, I think what is certain is that these US and EU sanctions will weaken the Russian economy significantly, both over the short term and over the long run.
Right. So, Professor Shen, remind us of Cuban Missile Crisis. Can we learn any lesson? Can we learn any lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis at all?
Yeah, it's quite ironic. It's just a new version of Cuban Missile Crisis. You know that for those people who loving peace, sometimes they will praise the Soviet leaders in that Cuban Missile Crisis, because finally he decided, even though he will lose face, he will withdraw its troops without really go to war.
Right.
And here comes to the United States. It's quite clear if United States or the NATO leaders, they want to lose their face, which means make a very open, public, prominent, commitment. I will not develop the Ukraine as part of NATO's, make that promise. So that's also very interesting. We have that stories. German generals, when he go to India in a closed door dialogue, he said that we need to respect Putin. So we need to deliver Putin our respect. We need to promise Putin that we will not accept Ukraine. And we already decided it. And then people concern, why just no single US or EU leaders make that commitment publicly to Putin? So it's quite clear. You got that, if you deliver that promise, anyone who deliver that promise definitely will lost its domestic politics. Right. It will be a personal political disaster. It means he will sacrifice his own political career for the whole interest of the free world. It's quite clear no single leaders want to do that. Right. They want to become kind of freedom fighters. I'm fighting a dictatorship Russia by expansion NATO to its gateways, and so that I'm the heroes and you need to elect me again. So it's kind of tricky. People just confuse or mess anything together, especially they blur the difference between domestic political games and very serious geopolitical games among great powers. That's two different kind of games, right. But now they mix together.
Right. So you're basically saying that within the country, their domestic politics are probably divided, so they have different voices.
Yep. It's quite clear. But on the foreign policies, one single countries, you need to have a coherent understanding of your foreign policies, your national interest. That means the interest of the whole nations, not the interest of single politicians, not the interest of single political parties. That's quite different games comparing to domestic politics. And it's just like Professor Mearsheimer, he mentioned that can you imagine United States agreed Mexico to become the member of military alliance with China and Russia, and allow China and Russia to launch to deploy their short-range missiles inside Mexico and say, okay, Mexico's sovereignty state, they have the right to make that decision. Right. It's impossible, unthinkable. But Russia is the same country as the United States, have the same logic. So why or how dare you believe that while the United States not allow Mexico become member of Warsaw Pact, and Russia will accept Ukraine become a
right.
NATO
right.
member state? That's the
That's right.
How to say?
Letting alone
Difficult.
letting alone Ukraine and Russia, they have a lot of historical legacy, both culturally and
Yeah.
also ethnically. So these are
Yeah.
all those important links between these two countries, even though they're separate nation states. They're sovereign nation states. One thing is also very interesting now. With China also becoming very important in this whole dynamic. What do you think China's role in trying to resolving this crisis? Let me ask Roy this question first. So Roy, from an observer's perspective, what do you think China's role in this dynamic?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. I guess I really don't have a response to that. But I do think here, I think China is in quite an awkward position here from a export controls and sanctions perspective. Even though the U.S. export controls and sanctions are apparently targeting Russia, but in many ways they are designed to really target Chinese companies that conduct business with Russia. For these companies, they really are at great risk of being sanctioned or otherwise penalized by the U.S. government. So it's a very difficult situation for the Chinese companies.
Right. Okay. So Shen Yi, let's lay out all the scenarios now with European countries are also talking to Ukraine and Russia, but with their own agenda in between, and also Ukraine side is in the middle of the whole crisis. Russia and United States apparently lost trust already, along with all those NATO countries. China seems the only big country, a big power left that can probably do a mediation in between. So what is your take on that? What kind of role do you think China can facilitate to resolve this crisis?
Oh, I know that yes, there's people in the European Union talking about the possibility that China should become the moderate.
Right.
While in the same interview, he mentioned that can the free world trust China? Free world trust China. These single questions represent how tough challenges China face now. I think the official, I fully support and agree our government's official announcement on all these things. But the question is quite clear. If, let's imagine, it's a pure imagine, that one day China launch an announcement, say that I have a suggestion. All these guys, you should do this. For example, the NATO should make a commitment to recognize the legal security concern of Russia. And Ukraine make some commitment, and Russia do some things, for example, withdraw your troops. I did not talk about the Russia side. Can European Union and the United States accept China's advice?
What do you think?
If they can accept China's advice, why don't they hear the advice from Professor Henry Kissinger?
Right.
If they can avoid it. It will never happen. But now it happened. It means they can't. And they continue. Sometimes they have a very wishful thinking. They wish China to do what they want China to do in their ways to solve these problems.
Well, apparently this is not going to happen because each country has their own agenda, and also for the benefits of,
But so I think the real challenge on these things, the challenger for those European Unions and the United States is not the challenger in the real world, but the challenger on the ways they think and understand how this world runs. They need to change their mind. If they need to change their mind. If they don't change their mind, they will not understand that things. And then we have to just have a deadlock, very pathetic deadlock. The most pathetic part is, before this deadlock happened, the Western peoples, the smart Western professions, like Henry Kissinger, they know how to avoid it, but no one listens.
Right. So
no one listened their advice.
Right. Right. So those are probably the scenarios that we really want to avoid. So Roy, back to you. You mentioned that all these sanctions and all these crises are going to influence Chinese companies. So what are the mitigants that Chinese companies should take to get rid of this? Try to stay away from this crisis and sanctions.
Yeah. Again, that's a really good question. So I think over the short term, the Chinese companies doing business in Russia really need to think long and hard about what kind of compliance and risk control measures they can take to mitigate the relevant risks.
Right.
On a high level, I think there are three things they should do. One is the first thing they want to do is to really understand their own products. They want to understand to what extent their products are affected by the long-arm jurisdiction of U.S. export controls laws. Like to what extent do their products incorporate U.S. origin content, to what extent they use U.S. equipment, technology, or software in the R&D and manufacturing process. And then if their products are subject to U.S. jurisdiction, they need to figure out the relevant export classifications of the products to understand whether from a U.S. government's perspective, a license from a U.S. government is required. So because if they don't follow the relevant U.S. licensing requirements, whether they like it or not, the U.S. government could blacklist those companies, which may have serious consequences on the company's operations outside China. They could be cut off from the U.S. dollar system. They could be cut off from U.S. origin items or technology, etc.
Right.
And the second thing they need to understand is really to what extent their business partners in Russia are sanctioned. And to the extent they have sanctioned Russian customers, they need to understand the relevant secondary sanctions and potential risks involved in those sanctions.
Right.
I think the third thing they want to do is really over the long term, I think they also need to think long and hard about their exposure to U.S. nexus, like the extent they rely on U.S. technology, U.S. raw materials, to the extent they can. And if they want to really serious about keeping the Russian market, they might over the long term think about reducing such reliance.
See, those things are so ironic. We have been talking about globalization for decades, but now, this is a totally deglobalization process, and, you are offering all those solutions, try to mitigate the impact from those deglobalization process. Again, there's another thing that is very ironic during this crisis that we noticed. I'm sure, Professor Shen, you also noticed that, is that a media war. There's a war happening, or there's military tension happening on the ground, but also there's a war happening on the media front as well. There are a lot of fake news, controversies, and you couldn't tell which one is true and which one is false. Why is that?
I think that actually, when you're talking about Russian launched its military operation in Ukraine, there's three battlefields. The first is the army battlefield. There's tanks, jets, planes, rockets, and missiles. And the second battlefield is political and economic battlefield. The U.S. launched its long arms, the long arms sanction all around the world. But even though the United States is not powerful enough to use that long arms. The third is media war. This media war is very interesting. For Ukraine side, they keep sending these informations, and from Russian side, in this battlefield, the Russian has faced the attack in this media warfare from not only Ukraine but from European Union and the United States. It's quite clear that the United States and Ukraine continue to delete accounts to send all those pro-Russia informations, even though they are real informations. And while at the same time, they keep those websites and so to continue to providing the fake news if they pro the Ukraine side. It's kind of side-taking actions, especially to those Metas, those Twitters, those
right.
large media companies. And I can understand for Ukraine side, if they can manipulate informations and ensure that it can bubble the Western peoples with this fake news pro-Ukraine side, they can launch a political atmosphere, and so that he believe he can use this political atmosphere to mobilize Western peoples to ensure the NATO and make a commitment, acceptance of Ukraine, and
that's pathetic.
to even to. It's very pathetic, but it's ironic. It's the most ironic part is the capacities to manipulate information give him a fake sense of power.
Exactly.
He believes he is so powerful. He can manipulate the U.S. He can make decision in White House, not in Kyiv. He can make decision in White House to accept or to support or even fight Russia for the reason of protection Ukraine. It's pathetic, but that happens.
Right. Okay. So Roy, do you think is it even legitimate for Facebook, Google, Metaverse now, Facebook, Twitter, Google, to twist the news, or they block ads from Russia, and they do a lot of so-called manipulation? Is it even legal?
Yeah, I think that's a $1 million question here, and there are a lot of discussions even in the United States about the practices of these technology companies. Not just the way they censor Ukraine-related news, but the way they censor all kinds of news. So a lot of people here in the United States now are beginning to question the apparently unchecked power of these media companies on what kind of news they want to show up on their websites and what kind of news they do not. So again, that is a very good question here, and there's a lot of discussions actually here in Washington D.C. about what kind of regulations should be put on those technology companies. Right. But of course, I wouldn't predict that these companies' practice on Ukraine would be particularly frowned upon by U.S. politicians. It's really their power to censor news that's quite controversial, even in the United States.
If media cannot report truth and reflect truth, that is really pathetic to me. So gentlemen, my last question, a very important question to you, is I want your view on what are the condition precedents for a ceasefire. So Shen-Yi, why don't we start from you first?
I think that actually after the second round of the peace talk, the Moscow agreed to have a ceasefire. They said that all the troops into the silence mood. But it's quite unfortunate. Two things happens. The first, in Kyiv, there's a news report. Those neo-Nazis or those extremist activists, they just destroy those railway systems to avoid the civilian peoples to go through this pass. And the second, one member of this negotiation teams had been killed.
Right.
No matter for what kind of reasons, it's quite clear that some forces did not want this negotiation continue. So maybe in future we can see such kind of scenarios. First, military actions will recover. And the second, sometimes even kind of escalations. And then finally people agree. They have a finally, some people inside the Ukraine wake up. They just wake up from their dreams and face the realities and accept the reality to take a more practical attitude. And then we can see more round of the dialogue, more round of negotiations, and finally lead to the ceasefire and finally a peace solution of all this mess.
Right. So you think it will still take rounds of negotiations? Roy, what's your take? What do you think?
Even the military escalations will be highly probable.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Roy, what's your take on that?
Well, I don't have a comment on that, except that I personally certainly hope that there will be a ceasefire and, in fact, a complete termination of the current conflict as soon as possible.
Right. So, Shen-Yi, before I still want your view on this thing. How long do you think this military tension will last, in your view? You just mentioned rounds of negotiations. In your view, will it be like a couple of months' time or several weeks' time?
Maybe months.
I
wish weeks or even days or hours. If next minute this ceasefire happens, there will be a huge fortune for all those peoples, but quite deep regret, it cannot happen because still people need more time to wake up to make their mind better understanding of all these things.
Great. Thank you very much, Shen Yi and Roy Liu joining from DC. Thank you for your insights. We have to stop here. My colleague will keep bringing you more updates on Ukraine and Ukraine coverage. As what Professor Shen just mentioned, we hope peace can arrive soon. This is Kate Kui live from Beijing. Until next time, see you now.